The Crusades, Chapter 14, Section 1. The Crusades were a military campaign between the Christians in Western Europe in order to regain the Holy Land that were taken by the Turks and Muslims in the 11th, 12th, and 13th century. The Turks, during this period of time, expanded their territory and were beginning to threaten the Byzantine Empire. The emperor asked Pope Urban II for military aid. He agreed to help because he hoped that this would help reunite the split between the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church. In a speech to several people in France, Pope Urban II encouraged the lords to stop fighting amongst themselves and to focus on the Turks. Before this time, the church was going through a spiritual revival. Starting in about 900s, monasteries helped bring about a spiritual growth in both education and the study of Christian beliefs. As you can see by the map, several different churches, monasteries, and universities were springing up in the Holy Roman Empire and what is modern-day France and England. As we recall, some of the problems in the church that developed during this time. Some church officials were marrying even though the church objected. Some officials were practicing the selling of religious offices. And kings were appointing bishops while the church officials, especially the Pope, believed that they should be the ones responsible for appointing bishops. The Crusades. Pope Urban II went across Europe for 9 months talking up the Crusades. Many were ready to jump on board. Christians thought it was their duty to reclaim the Holy Land. Nobles wanted to expand their land and also wanted the fame of being and winning a crusade, and peasants wanted a change from their lives that they had been living for so many years. About 12,000 untrained soldiers from France and 2 other groups from Germany headed across Europe towards Constantinople. As you can see from the map, 3 different armies, 2 of which started out in modern-day France and the other in the Holy Roman Empire, gathered up in Constantinople. You can see this from the red lines from the map. Why did they go? What were they promised? Pope Urban wanted to stop the civil war that was occurring, and many of the landowners and peasants were underfed and had lacked many of the resources necessary to survive. So they were promised rich, fertile land for victory, to be free of debt and taxes, and most importantly, to be given a Pope Urban II promise that God would forgive any sins that they would commit through the acts of being successful in regaining the Holy Land. And as you can see from the image, the red cross on their tunic, which represented the idea that they were obedient to God's will. The goals of the Crusades. Like I said before, the Pope wanted to reclaim Jerusalem and reunite Christians. Kings used the Crusades to send away knights who were causing trouble, a constant battle between nobles and the kings through the feudal period. Younger sons hoped to earn land and glory, and many have went for the idea of adventure, since most of them had not left Western Europe or even the manners that they had lived on. The later Crusades changed the idea that merchants and others would regain trade routes that had been lost when the Turks controlled the Middle East. The story of the First Crusade. The First Crusade is also known as the Nobles' Crusade. In 1097, the lords led their crusades across Europe. They took with them vassals, wives, kids, clerks, cooks, and blacksmiths. They also had supplied themselves with battle wagons, rations, horses, and other things. Some of them had to sell jewelry and land to cover the costs. Over 30,000 of them arrived in modern-day Turkey and had defeated the Turks. Then they headed towards Syria. They were unprepared for the hot weather, and many of the Crusaders and those who went with them died of starvation and dehydration along the way. Of the survivors that conquered Syria, then moved into Jerusalem. 12,000 of them arrived in Jerusalem in 1066, and they were able to recapture the Holy Land. After winning the battles against the Muslim Turks, Crusaders slaughtered hundreds of men, women, and children in their victory, an act in which the Muslim Turks in later Crusades will remember, and some of the same situations will occur later on in the Crusades. The Second Crusade was known as the Crusade of Kings, and it was led a battle between Saladin, ruler of Egypt, who was able to reunite the Muslims and regain the Holy Land in 1174. Some of the Christians still occupied the land which they had won years before. Saladin was able to take back Jerusalem, but he refused to massacre the Christians that lived there. As years went on, much respect was gained between the Christians and the Muslims as they began to learn from each other. Christians learned a lot about medicine and science from the Muslims, who were much more advanced during this period of time in history. The Second Crusade of Kings was urged by the Church in Western Europe. The Crusaders were led by three most powerful rulers in Europe during the time: King Richard I of England, Emperor Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, and King Philip II of France. The Second Crusade was a complete failure for the Crusaders. The first situation that occurred was that Frederick died in Asia Minor, or modern-day Turkey, and his army retreated and returned back to Western Europe. Philip and Richard were always fighting over which towns to take over and when to attack. They were successful in taking a few towns, but eventually Philip returns back to France, leaving Richard alone to fight. Richard was known in history as a brave warrior and had several matchups. He and his armies had several matchups against Saladin and the Muslim Turks. After 3 years, a truce was finally signed after either side could gain victory. The agreement or truce was signed in which the Muslims would keep control of Jerusalem, but it would allow Christians to come in and out to worship in the Holy Land. After the Second Crusade, there was a loss of ideal among the Crusaders. There was a loss of the belief that they were doing the right thing. So in 1202, Pope Innocent III made another call for the Crusades, Many of the knights answered the call. At this point, many of the knights were a much younger group, looking for glory, looking for a way to gain land. They came by sea. This time, instead of going into Constantinople, which had already been taken over by the Muslim Turks, their goal was to enter into Constantinople and take down the city. They used Venice as their port and made a deal with the people of Venice to provide supplies in return for trade goods that they would take from Constantinople. During this time, the Europeans moved into Constantinople and destroyed and killed many different groups of people, including other Christians. This really shocked the people back home in Western Europe. As years go on, towards the end of the Crusades, one of the most difficult to understand crusade was known as the Children's Crusade in 1212. At this point, the peasants were the Crusaders were lacking in any soldiers, so anyone, including very young age soldiers, were looking for a way out of their situation. Most of the soldiers were French children, and they were mostly coming from situations in which they were peasants. They set sail from France and were not successful at all, and after the losses, many of them were sold into slavery by those who they were fighting against. The second group left from Germany by foot, many of which died of starvation or disease.